Hi, thanks for watching our presentation. I'm Miriam Matteson, a professor and interim associate dean at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio. My collaborators on this project were Yue Ming, a doctoral student in the School of Information at Kent State, and Hannah Wheeler and Matt McShane, master's students in the School of Information. The background for this study came from the integration of two related interests. Hannah was interested in college-age students and how they learn to discern real versus false information. I was interested in how students' own thinking about their own knowledge and beliefs about how their knowledge is built and how those ideas might connect to their information literacy. Our numerous conversations in and around these ideas led us to find some interesting theory. Two frameworks underpin the research here. RJM is a cognitive processing model that models the development of reflective thinking from late adolescence through early adulthood. The model describes a progression of underlying assumptions about knowledge and about knowing and how knowledge is gained, called epistemic cognition. The second framework is the information literacy framework from the Association of College and Research Libraries. The RJM is based on three observations. First, there are differences in people's underlying assumptions about knowledge. Two, the differences in these assumptions are related to the way people make and justify their own judgments about ill-structured problems, problems that don't have formal logical solutions to them. And then the third basic observation is that there's a developmental sequence in the patterns of responses and judgments about such ill-structured problems. So as you can see on the slide here, the developmental model is expressed over 3 levels and 7 stages. In stage 1 through 3, students believe that knowledge is pretty concrete and absolute and comes from an authority figure. They're confident that what they know is correct and that their job is to find out that one right answer from an authoritative source, such as their teacher. In stages 4 and 5, students are more able to accept the uncertainty inherent in knowledge, but they presume that that uncertainty is due just to missing knowledge, or they just have to find it. In these stages, students accept that knowledge is subjective and contextual, and they're aware that the knowing process involves using evidence, but that they tend to use that evidence to support previously held beliefs rather than using it to form new beliefs. Stages 6 and 7 of this model then depict reflective thinking, where students are able to recognize the inherent uncertainty in knowledge claims, and they're able to use evidence to support reasonable judgments about ill-structured problems. The ACRL framework, many of you may be familiar with already, is a set of 6 frames that describe knowledge practices and dispositions related to information literacy. Several of the frames describe knowledge and knowing such that information literacy is also tied to high levels of epistemic cognition. So for example, on the slide here, I've pulled out 2 frames. On the left, we have authority is constructed and contextual. And you can see from the sections that I've highlighted that this frame suggests that students are able to recognize different types of authority, that they are open to new perspectives, additional voices, changes in schools of thought, and that they value diverse ideas. Or on the right-hand side, scholarship as conversation. In this frame, it highlights the notion that, and I'm quoting here, instead of seeking discrete answers to complex problems, experts understand that a given issue may be characterized by several competing perspectives as a part of an ongoing conversation. You can see how in both of these frames we see similarities to that level of reflective thinking, stages 6 and 7, from the King and Kitchener model. So we believe that students are asked to engage in reflective thinking when they face these ill-structured problems, problems that are difficult to define in terms of their completeness or their certainty. It's this messy space. And for many students, a lot of their academic work, the assignments through which they develop those information literacy skills, those assignments live in that messy space. Those assignments are ill-structured problems that are difficult to define. And so we think that these two frameworks, the RJM and the ACRL framework, really operate in parallel paths in the mind of the student, and that both of these models are essentially working with this notion of epistemic cognition, which is knowledge about the fundamental nature of knowledge, especially the justification and truth of beliefs. But even as we appreciate the parallel nature of how epistemic cognition can be understood, we also believe there's an equally important aspect to learning that speaks to that desire, that willingness to even engage with that ill-structured problem. So what factor is that Kickstarter? Well, back to the literature we went, and we discovered the notion of epistemic motivation, which, as you can see here, is the desire to think deeply in order to gain knowledge and understand the world. It's this inclination to achieve a thorough understanding of something. So we believe that epistemic motivation might be a necessary co-condition for the development of epistemic cognition, and then for reaching those deeper levels of reflective judgment and deeper levels of information literacy. So our study here explores epistemic motivation as a construct that might predict information literacy skills. We followed a quantitative approach to our research, building out a questionnaire using existing measures to capture epistemic motivation and information literacy. There are several constructs already existing that we were able to use to try to capture this notion of epistemic motive. The first one we used was need for cognitive closure, and this is actually a framing of epistemic motivation to look at kind of the opposite of epistemic motivation, epistemic closure. So need for cognitive closure is a motivation to seek firm and unambiguous answers about the social world. And it's characterized by this idea of seizing on the incoming information and freezing on that information to prevent future changes in thinking, to kind of lock in one's thinking. So together, this seizing and freezing function helps individuals avoid that feeling of uncertainty. It gets people to lock in and feel certain about something right away. And some people really want that in their lives. So that's need for cognitive closure. Need for cognition measures kind of the other end of that spectrum. And it's a measure characterized by items such as, I prefer complex problems to simple problems, or I like to have the responsibility of handling a situation that requires a lot of thinking. Or, reverse coded, thinking is not my idea of fun. So need for cognition is trying to get to that, I love that deep thinking kind of aspect. Openness to experience is one of the 5 factors in the 5-factor model of personality, and it's the dimension that speaks to interest in and openness to new experiences, interpersonal interactions, values, and attitudes. And it's characterized by items like, I enjoy carrying the conversation to a higher level, or I enjoy hearing new ideas. And then lastly, we also used actively open-minded thinking. This is another individual dispositional measure that is often used as a proxy for reflective thinking. And it's associated with this willingness to look at alternative viewpoints or opposite ways of thinking or countervailing evidence. And it has items such as willingness to be convinced by opposing arguments is a sign of good character, or people should take into consideration evidence that goes against conclusions they favor. So these were the measures that we used to try to capture that notion of epistemic motive. And then we also used a measure of information literacy, We chose to use an item called Project Trails, which is a web-based assessment. It's freely available, used to measure students' information literacy skills. Now, when Project Trails was developed, it was mapped to K-12 grade standards at 3rd, 6th, 9th, and 12th grade. We used items from the 12th grade instrument because that aligned pretty closely to our sample population, as you'll see here in the next slide. So Project Trails is divided into 5 sections that loosely map to the main sub-skills of information literacy: developing a topic, identifying potential sources, developing, using, and revising search strategies, evaluating sources and information, and using information responsibly. So we used 3 items from each of those 5 sub-skills to create the information literacy measure in our study. So we collected data in spring of 2021. We also ran the study in spring of 2019. I'm going to report here on just the spring 2021 data. We used an existing course of basic public speaking course pitched at the freshman-sophomore level. And in this course, students were able to earn 15 points toward their total of 1,000 course points if they participated in research studies. You can see from our sample it was predominantly female, and the average age was around 20, and the average number of college credits completed was 30, which positions a student with 30 credit hours is about the end of their freshman year. So given this age and demographic, we felt comfortable using the information literacy items from the 12th grade test of Project Trails. So in our paper, in the proceedings, you can read the statistical data and the data analysis techniques that we ran. I'm just going to report here the findings that we got. Of our 4 predictor variables, we found that 3 of them, that is actively open-minded thinking, need for closure, and need for cognition, were all significantly related to the information literacy scores after controlling for gender, age, and college credits. The only non-significant finding here was the variable openness to experience. Further, we found that actively open-minded thinking contributed 22% of the variance in students' IELTS scores, and the other 2 variables contributed around 4% of their IELTS scores. The full model explained 32% of the variance in information literacy scores. We also did some analysis around the predictive power of those four variables on the 5 subcategories on the Project Trails. And here again, we found some mixed results. None of those 4 predictors were significant in predicting students' ability to develop topics. For their ability to identify sources, actively open-minded thinking and need for cognition both were significant there in predicting that skill. For revising and using and developing search strategies, only actively open-minded thinking was significant. And for evaluating sources and information, all 3, actively open-minded thinking, need for cognition, and need for cognitive closure, all predicted a student's score on evaluating sources of information. And then for using information responsibly, again, actively open-minded thinking and need for cognitive closure were significant predictors. So what does it all mean? I went through that pretty fast, but what we found is that actively open-minded thinking and, to a lesser extent, but still significant, need for cognition predicted IELTS scores in the expected direction. Students who reported greater comfort with processing complex ideas and seeking out countervailing viewpoints did better on the information literacy test. So this suggests that the more we can do as instructors to help students develop a comfort with and a curiosity for complex and inconsistent ideas, the more students may be able to take in the more advanced knowledge and practice around information literacy. The fact that openness to experience was not a significant predictor might really be explained by the fact that it is a personality measure and not really a direct measure of epistemic motivation. It comes from that 5-factor model of personality, and we suspect that it may be really more accurately measuring a general disposition towards new things and not so much a trait associated with academic engagement. And then we have the need for cognitive closure. So, contrary to what we expected, students who scored higher on the need for cognitive closure also performed better in the information literacy test. That is, students who reported a greater need to seize and freeze when seeking information to reach certainty also scored higher on the IL test compared with students with a lesser need for that cognitive closure. This one was the really puzzling result. One possible explanation could be related to the level of the students in our sample. The age group, if you recall, was around 20 years old. The median was 20 years old, with 30 credit hours of coursework under their belts. And students at that level are likely to be in stages 3 and 4 of the reflective judgment model, which is still very much in that freeze and seize aspect of epistemic cognition. So it's possible that these results, in fact, show that developmental and transitional nature of reflective judgment, where students are beginning to be open to multiple sources of truth and knowledge, but are still pretty comfortable with a more objective view of knowledge and knowing. Another explanation could be the manner in which we measured information literacy. The Project Trails test is a right-wrong multiple choice test. So it's possible that the nature of this type of measurement is actually preferred by students whose cognitive motivation is to seize and freeze on that one right answer. Rather than capturing students' deeper thought processes or their beliefs or understandings around IL concepts, it's possible that Project Trails is measuring more discrete, surface-level IL skills, and that the instrument just doesn't quite have the validity to capture the cognitive processes that would be associated for need for cognitive closure, and that perhaps an alternative method for measuring information literacy would yield different results. So what kind of interventions can librarians use to help fire up students' epistemic cognition and invoke their epistemic motivation? How can we make IL content interesting and inspire curiosity and engagement? This is the big question. We offer 2 big ideas here. The first is to understand students where they are. They're on this journey of reflective judgment, and they're somewhere in those stages, and they're, depending on their age and their experience, they may be pretty early in that developmental framework. So can you gauge the interest that they have where they are now? Can you even anonymously ask questions about how interested are they or how curious are they about what they're doing? Maybe we can even find out how useful they expect the learning to be. Bringing that kind of awareness of where they are to the surface for them and for you may help tailor the instruction to be more suitable for where they are in their journey. And if you do that and learn that students are not that interested just yet, are there things that you can do to change the nature of your instruction to mimic something that more resonates with where they are at this point in their development? Perhaps some examples, some analogies, or some practice items from non-academic settings could be used to illustrate those key IL concepts like searching and evaluating results. Really, lots of us have a strong ability to search for information on things we care about. So what analogies could be drawn from students' hobby lives or social lives to effectively illustrate IL concepts? And then the second big idea is let them know where they're headed, help them know where they're going. If and when students seem to be still more in that seize and freeze mode, can you describe a little bit the epistemic journey that they're on, whether or not they even realize it? Without being paternalistic, of course, is there a way to share with them or give them some permission to lean into the uncertainty and the messiness of this kind of cognitive work? Can you tell them about a time where you were struggling with some messy problem and how you worked through it? Can you reassure them that the discomfort that's inherent in this process is to be expected and it's not something that should make them feel bad about what they're doing or where they are? Further, can you have them practice the messy parts? If we think of the main skills and dispositions associated with the ACRL frames, can we build out instruction that kind of leans into that uncertainty rather than emphasizing a deliverable or a destination? This may be most effective if you can partner with the class instructor, of course, but even if you can't, scaffolding some assignments that emphasize the ill-structured pieces along the way may help students be more willing to try them on and try them out rather than rush past them. And of course, not every contact point with a student will be an unleashing of this epistemic joy and development. Sometimes it might just be most effective to focus on some of the extrinsic benefits to be had from the effort of digging in a little and engaging, either to gain a reward or perhaps to avoid a loss. Demonstrating how engaging with IL concepts can result in a higher grade or a time-saving mechanism or just making something a little bit easier in the long run may be an effective way that causes a student to stretch a little and engage a little bit more, which in turn creates a new experience for the student on which they can draw to learn new patterns of meaning making and apply that to future situations. So we feel we're just at the beginning of our line of inquiry here and that it merits more attention. We'd like to tweak our design a little bit and increase the sample to include students with wider age ranges and wider numbers of credit hours. Maybe we'll drop openness as a measure, but perhaps pull in some other individual difference measures, maybe like self-efficacy. Is there something to be looked at the interplay between one's belief and one's ability to achieve something and their own cognitive development? We also think we need to look for alternative ways to measure information literacy. Although Project Trails made a lot of sense for the parameters and scope of this particular study, we think that a different style of test may be more effective at really tapping into that richer, more qualitative understanding of information literacy. So perhaps field experiments or collaborations with class instructors where students' IL knowledge and skill could be captured and evaluated through observation, interview, or even assessment of scholarly deliverables might provide us with an alternative and richer way to capture information literacy. And then finally, as we tweak our design and our instruments and our procedures, we anticipate the need to find faculty collaborators with whom we can work over time to look at possible intervention strategies and methods that might help develop this epistemic motive. Thanks for watching the presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. My email is there. Thank you.